morning. Madame la Présidente, honorable deputy speakers, honorable members of the Parliament, good morning to all of you. Like my predecessor, I would like to underline that it's a very great pleasure for us to be here. We greatly value the interaction that we have with you because at the end, as my colleague David has expressed, at the end of the day, this is your responsibility to ensure that IHL is properly implemented in each of the states that you represent. And in addition to that, we also value that discussion because we hope it will help you to make sure that the laws that you adopt that may not necessarily be directly IHL laws, that they are in line with international humanitarian law. And this is exactly the topic I'm going to, or one such area that I'm going to address, which is how international humanitarian law applies to counterterrorism. I have decided to divide my presentation in two parts. In the first one, I'd like to make some general comments on how IHL relates to counterterrorism legislation, and in that regard, the key message that we have for you today is to ensure that there is no contradiction between counterterrorism laws and IHL, because this can negatively impact the application of IHL and at the end the protection that it affords to the civilian population. The second topic I'm going to talk about is the potential of criminalization of humanitarian action that can result from counterterrorism legislations. And in that regard, the key message that we have for you is the importance to ensure that counterterrorism laws do not adversely affect humanitarian action and that they preserve the impartial and neutral humanitarian action. Okay, let's go to the first topic. And before I'm going to address how IHL applies to terrorism, I think it goes without saying, but just for the sake of clarity, just to underline that the ICRC condemns in the strongest terms any act of terrorism. Terrorism or acts of terrorism when committed in times of war are contrary to the values that we defend, to the principles that we defend, and they are also contrary to the spirit and to the letter of IHL. In the same vein, we recognize that states are legitimate to take measures. Indeed, they have to take measures to protect their citizens to fight terrorism. What we insist on is that any measure taken in the fight against terrorism be in line with international humanitarian law, with international law in general. And what does this mean for international humanitarian law? First of all, I'd like to underline, I think it's clear if I follow up on the presentation made by my colleague, that IHL only applies if the fight against terrorism takes the form of armed conflict. There's today a bit of tendency of a militarization of the response to terrorism, but I'd just like you to be aware that IHL does not apply any time states take measures against terrorism. Sometimes such measures are below the threshold of armed conflict, and in these situations IHL does not apply. But when the threshold of armed conflict is reached, IHL applies, and all parties to the conflict are bound to respect the rules. There is some reluctance, admittedly, for some states to recognize the existence of an armed conflict and thereby the application of IHL. So the second point I wanted to make is that IHL is very, very clear about this. IHL does not give any legitimacy to any non-state armed groups, including armed groups that may have been declared terrorists. So this is very clear in IHL. The application of IHL does not give any legitimacy to terrorist groups. So when IHL applies, what does it mean? The important thing to keep in mind is that IHL prohibits most acts that are commonly regarded as terrorist. Bombings in a marketplace, placing an IED, an improvised explosive device on a busy road that is also frequent, used by civilians, taking hostages, taking measures of terrorism or acts that are aimed at spreading terror among the civilian population. All these acts are already prohibited by IHL when committed in the times of war. So to sum, if I simplify a little bit, what we generally want to prohibit in counterterrorism legislations, all these acts, when committed in times of war, they are already prohibited. They can be punished as violations of IHL or as war crimes, as the case may be. So the IHL provides a strong and adequate legal framework, and to a very large degree it pursues the same purpose as counterterrorism laws, which are to protect citizens. But there is also differences between IHL and counterterrorism legislations, because both of them, they have been designed for different purposes. There are many of them, but I just wanted to highlight one, which is very important, which is that international humanitarian law, as David has explained just a couple of minutes ago, international humanitarian law regulates both lawful and unlawful acts of violence. As he has explained, in a situation of armed conflict, it is lawful to attack a military objective, but it is never lawful to attack a civilian person or a civilian object. On the other hand, counterterrorism legislation, they follow a very different logic. They say everything, any act that is committed is necessarily unlawful. So any act committed by a terrorist group or by a group designated as terrorist is unlawful. So this, from a legal perspective and from an IHL perspective, raises some questions. Because it basically goes against when these CT laws are applied in situations of armed conflict, this application can run counter to the very fundamental principles of IHL, which, as I said, distinguishes between lawful and unlawful acts of violence. So why is it important that we keep the two bodies of law very separate? The first one is we have to remind ourselves that the purpose of IHL is the protection of civilian population. We have to find ways to ensure that parties to a conflict never attack civilian populations, that they carry out attacks only against legitimate military objects. Now, if for a person that is a member of a group that has been designated as terrorist, and that for that person it doesn't make a difference whether he conducts an attack that is lawful under IHL or that is unlawful under IHL, there won't be any reason for this person to respect the rules of IHL, because no matter what, his act will be illegal. So there's no incentive for that person to respect the fundamental rules of IHL, which mainly aim at respecting and protecting the civilian population. In addition, applying CT laws in situation of armed conflict can obfuscate the prospect that Article 6 of Additional Protocol 2, which I have copied here on the slide, ever be implemented. Article 6 of Additional Protocol 2 encourages states to grant to the largest extent possible amnesties at the end of an armed conflict. Obviously, this can never apply to persons that have committed war crimes, but it is again a measure that can help to ensure better respect for the rules. So persons that have participated in the armed conflict and that have respected the rules of IHL, they are encouraged, or states are encouraged to give them, to grant them amnesties. This is, of course, also to be seen in the context of peace negotiations and reconciliation, where amnesties can be a very powerful tool. Again, if CT laws are applied in situations of armed conflict, there is no prospect that this provision ever be implemented. Now, what does it mean for you? We have 3 recommendations for you on this basis. The first one is to ensure that IHL, or violations of IHL and war crimes, are criminalized under domestic law. This allows you to, or allows states to prosecute terrorist acts that are violations of IHL or that are war crimes, to prosecute these acts under the regime of IHL, which has specifically been designed to apply in situation of armed conflict. The second recommendation we have is to include clauses in counterterrorism laws that reiterate that anything done to fight terrorism be in line with international law. I have here copied an example that is found in the African Union model anti-terrorism law, which reads, reaffirming that the fight against terrorism must be carried out in accordance with international law, including international human rights, refugee, and humanitarian law. And the same idea can also be found in the ECOWAS Political Declaration Against Terrorism, in the preamble, in paragraph 10, but also in the ECOWAS strategy, the fight against terrorism, that the idea that measures against terrorism must be compatible with international law is found in many different places. The third and last recommendation that we have for you is to include IHL safeguard clauses in counterterrorism legislation. Again, I have here copied an example from the African Union model anti-terrorism law, and the basic idea would be to say that acts which are committed in situations of armed conflict should be governed by IHL. So acts that are lawful under armed conflict under IHL should not be violation. And this is also why we, what we have discussed with the representative of the ECOWAS member states at the annual meeting some weeks ago, and it's also reflected in the ECOWAS plan of action on the implementation of IHL. There is a point that reads, ensure domestic legal frameworks related to counterterrorism do not overlap or contradict IHL. So this is something for you to consider, and that we would invite you to look at when you are discussing counterterrorism laws in your countries. So let's briefly move on to the second part, the potential criminalization of humanitarian action. This is something that has been discussed, I would say, in the past 10 or 15 years, or maybe already since the attacks on 9/11 and the global war on terror. What we have seen in recent years is that armed groups that are parties to a conflict increasingly resort to terrorist means. And as a reaction, states have tightened legislation applicable to the phenomenon of terrorism. And from what we could see sometimes when these laws are framed in very broad terms, when they include very broad criminalization of support to terrorist groups or terrorist financing, this can have a negative impact on the provision of life-saving humanitarian assistance. There are very clear examples where this can be demonstrated. For example, Somalia in 2009-2010, Al-Shabaab was proscribed as a terrorist group by the UN Security Council and by the US laws, and as a reaction, many donors have reduced their funding to humanitarian organizations that were active in Somalia. At the same time, there was a famine ravaging the southern part of Somalia, and many people could not receive relief because humanitarian agencies were reluctant to go into territories that were under the control of terrorist groups by fear that they would be criminalized. Now, this potential criminalization of humanitarian action, which is incidental or can be incidental to counterterrorism laws, can be said to be, first of all, contrary to the very idea of impartial and neutral humanitarian action. As you know, the ICRC and other humanitarian actors, by the Geneva Conventions, they are bound to respect the principles of impartiality and neutrality. This basically means that the humanitarian actors cannot take sides with any one party of the armed conflict, and that they must relieve suffering wherever suffering is found, regardless of who the person that is suffering is. Now, if CT counterterrorism legislation, they can lead to a situation where humanitarian actors would not any longer be allowed to access territories that are under the control of terrorist groups, or they can have other negative impacts on their delivery of humanitarian assistance. The result would be that these organizations are no longer able to respect the principles that they have to respect on the basis of the Geneva Conventions. Such criminalization of humanitarian action also can be contrary to legal obligations that states have under IHL. For instance, under Common Article 3, humanitarian organizations such as the ICRC have the right to offer their service to parties to an armed conflict. Very concretely, this means that regardless of who is the party to a conflict, whether it's a proscribed terrorist group or not, the ICRC must be able to offer its services. We must be able to engage with any party to an armed conflict in order to provide our humanitarian activities. If laws prohibit some form of interaction or engagement with terrorist groups only for humanitarian purposes, then this would not be in line with Common Article 3. The same thing holds true for the rules relating to humanitarian relief, which basically say that humanitarian actors must be allowed and facilitated access to a population in need. If a humanitarian actor is not allowed to reach out to a population that is living on the territory that is under the control of a terrorist group, then this enters into conflict with the provisions on humanitarian relief. And finally, we are going to discuss about it in a bit more details on the medical mission. This is one of the oldest rules of international humanitarian law, which basically says that any person which is in need of medical care and which does not or no longer participate in hostilities must be given such care. So this would also include fighters of armed opposition groups that are no longer participating in hostilities and that are in need of medical care. The rules also say that anyone, a doctor or a humanitarian actor that provides medical care in line with medical ethics cannot be punished for such acts. So these are just 3 areas of the law that may enter into conflict with counterterrorism legislation when they include very broad prohibitions that can also affect humanitarian action. So what is our recommendation to you to resolve that problem? Our recommendation is to include in counterterrorism legislation so-called humanitarian exemption clauses. The basic idea of such clauses would be to say very clearly that humanitarian action which is carried out in line with the humanitarian principles of impartiality and neutrality would not be regarded as a terrorist act or as support to terrorist groups. There is an example I copied here from the African Union model anti-terrorism laws, but other examples can also be found in the Australian laws, American laws, or from the European Union. And because this also is such an important aspect, there again, there's a point reflecting that idea in the ECOWAS plan of action on the implementation of IHL, which reads, ensure that humanitarian actors are able to conduct their non-discriminatory protection and assistance activities without the threat of prosecution or harassment by the government, security forces, or general population. So with that, I'm going to close and would like to invite you, if you have enough time and with the permission of the speaker, to open the floor for questions.